Howdy folks, and welcome to React Compiler. What is this thing? So React Compiler is something I've been hearing about, but I've never actually worked with it myself, and though I have kind of a cursory understanding of what it does, I've never really actually looked at the documentation or gone through it. So today we're going to do that together, and we're going to learn what this thing is, and I'm going to provide my commentary on what I think it could be useful for and really some pitfalls. Let's get started. So, to start off, to find this, I just ran a Google search for React Compiler, and this was the first page, which is pretty good. The second page was a Stack Overflow post asking what is React Compiler. So let's see. It is a part of React, and so it's built by the same team that does React, but I think it is a separate repository. Under construction, these docs are still a work in progress. Now, from what I understand, these docs are indeed a work in progress, and React Compiler is, I think, still experimental, but I think, and I may be completely wrong about this, but I think with React 20 or 21, I think it becomes like full-fledged. I think it's no longer experimental. So, you know, this documentation may be a little out of date, because I think that they still haven't updated this. React Compiler Working Group repo, I'm not going to take a look at that because that looks like that is a GitHub repository. So, experimental compiler, not ready for production. It requires React 19 release candidate. That's what RC stands for there. You know, actually, let me make this a little bit bigger. That's better. And maybe, yeah, there we go. So, it requires React 19 release candidate. And that already kind of tells you its age, because React 19 is, I feel like it's at least 2 years old at this point. I'm not completely sure what the latest version of React is, but I know 20 has been out for a little while. You may try user space implementation of the cache function. Yeah, not too worried about that. They're basically saying, like, if you're not using React 19, this probably won't work. And that's probably because they added in some stuff in React 19 to make this possible. Build time only tool. So what does that mean? Notice I skipped over this sentence because that's basically the same thing as this note. Build time only tool is kind of, so like when you run Webpack or Vite, that is at build time. So you run that, you run Vite build, you run Webpack build, it takes all of your code and it compiles it into a bundle. That's what we call the build, and things that run at that point are what we call build time. If you're more familiar with a language like Java or C++, you might understand this as compile time. But since JavaScript isn't really compiled, we use build time. That is in comparison to runtime, which happens only when the code is actually executed by the browser or by Node or whatever. Automatically optimizes your React app. So that's kind of interesting. So this is like almost like a static analysis tool or something. So static analysis tool, very popular with C++ again, and compiled languages. It looks through your language and kind of tries to figure out what it does and really get a better picture of what your language is actually trying, or your program is actually trying to accomplish, so that it can provide you optimizations or errors, right? So it's usually typed languages are better with this. Things like the C++ compiler or the Java compiler, things like that, they will actually use compile time optimization to, like, unraveling loops is a really popular one of those. But JavaScript doesn't really have anything for that, and you know, it is possible actually to write some extremely inefficient React code. Even with efficient React code, sometimes you put things in just for safety or whatever, or for future use that aren't super necessary, and I imagine it sounds like this compiler is something that tries to fix those things. Not completely sure how it does that or what it does yet. It works with plain JavaScript and understands the rules of React. This is kind of interesting here. It works with plain JavaScript because React itself does not work with plain JavaScript normally. Now, the thing is, React can work with plain JavaScript. You don't have to use JSX to use React. It's just JSX makes React a lot easier to work with. So the fact that they're saying this, when we run through a compile step, or a build step, I guess. I still call it compile because that's kind of what it is, but you know, they're calling it build here. When we run through a build step with a React application, if you're using, you know, Vite or Webpack or whatever, you'll run through Babel first. Well, that's what Webpack uses. I don't know what Vite uses under the hood. It might actually use Babel, but it doesn't require it as far as I know. Again, could be wrong on that. I haven't actually looked into it. But that turns the JSX into plain JavaScript, and then it bundles it. So I wonder if the React compiler does that step for you, maybe? Maybe it runs that transpile step, and that's why it says it works with plain JavaScript. Yeah, I'm not completely sure. So maybe that's the way I'm reading that, is like the React compiler itself does not work with JSX. It requires that to be transpiled first. Understands the rules of React. I don't actually know what these are. Let's see. Oh, components and hooks must be pure. React calls components and hooks rules of hooks. Okay. Yeah. So these are all things that, honestly, this is probably a good thing to read. I would imagine that if we went over these, they'd probably make sense. Like props and state are immutable. Don't mutate them. You don't need to rewrite any code to use it. That's nice, right? That's really good because that means you can just plug and play with this compiler. I can see someone then at like an organization that has a really slow React application asking one of their senior devs, hey, can you take a look at this React compiler thing I've heard about? I've heard it can boost performance by up to 60%. You probably won't get a 60% boost in performance. And I'm completely spitballing those numbers, but it's probably will give you a decent speed boost because it just optimizes for various things. And some of these applications can get really big. An ESLint problem plugin that surfaces the analysis from the compiler right in your editor. That's interesting. So the compiler does analysis as well. So then I could see, like, there's two reasons to use something like this. One is that when you run your build step, build time only tool, it builds and optimizes the code so that you don't have to. But then if it's doing analysis, it kind of makes it sound like they expect you to make the code changes as well. I feel like that might just be kind of an extra thing, because if it is a build time only tool, then I don't know why you'd be making changes. Maybe there's certain things that it thinks might be problematic, but it can't actually automatically optimize, so maybe it gives you stats on it or something. But those seem like they contradict each other, so it'll be interesting to see. But again, like they said, this documentation is, you know, still being fleshed out, so that might be it as well. Plugin runs independently of the code. Okay, that's why. So the compiler includes the plugin, but they're independent things. So it can be used even if you aren't using the compiler in your app. Okay, so that's like if you're not actually running ESLint tests, but you include an ESLint in your system, then VS Code will actually tell you the linter errors. So it sounds like it's kind of like this. I mean, this is even an ESLint plugin, so that's kind of cool, actually. Automatically memoizes your code. Ooh, that's fun. So for those of you that don't know what memoization is, basically it's kind of the idea that, let's say you have a function, and with React and React components and their functional components, that function is run, you know, every single time, and every time you call like a use hook, it runs that code, right? So that's kind of expensive because, okay, it's not true. Every time JavaScript has to create a brand new function, it'll create the function, it'll run that code, it runs through it, creates variables, things like that. It's not expensive, okay? That would be kind of a lie, but it's not cheap. It's not like free. It takes maybe like a tenth of a millisecond or something to actually run that. But then imagine you get to a really, really large application, and when you re-render all those components, even though React is using the shadow DOM and things like that, it's still calling all those functions. And so you may call 10,000 functions that way, which means that actually can add up to, you know, tenth of a second to do that stuff. So memoization, the idea behind memoization is that if you're using a use memo or use callback, react.memo, React is kind of similar to like a use effect, where you give it a series of parameters, And unless those parameters change, it doesn't actually recompute the callback function. It doesn't actually recreate the function or the variable. Now, I know if you're passing in a callback into use memo or use callback, it still actually has to create that function. So you're not really saving that, but it doesn't need to run it, basically. So yeah, I guess that's the real savings there. You still have to create it, but it doesn't actually have to run it, which is what can take some time. The downside of that can be if you're really using that in your React program, it means that the object doesn't change. So if you're using use memo on something like an object or an array, it means that that in memory state doesn't change. And actually that can be a boon in a lot of cases. Because if you are passing an object or an array into a child component, that child component will re-render if it's a different object or a different array. And in a lot of cases, you may actually be doing a spread or something on that, even though the actual data didn't change. It's a new fresh object. And there's a couple of patterns that you can have in React where you don't change the object at all, and it just kind of becomes a new object. And that will cause child components to re-render. So if you're memoizing that, it means that that object is the same, which means that when you pass it down to the child component does not re-render. Now, personally, when I've used memoization, I've actually run into more issues where I needed the component to re-render and it wasn't re-rendering. And the reason for that being because it just was memoized and the memoization got stuck. So I look at these things with a little bit of trepidation because while they can be really powerful, you really have to be careful about how you're using them. So if React compiler is automatically memoizing the code, which tells me it's wrapping these things as well, I feel like they'd have to be very careful about how they did that to make sure you weren't running into issues. Because one of the big problems we run into with things like React is once that code is transpiled, it's almost impossible to debug because it looks like gibberish. And so if you run into issues with this stuff, or it actually puts out code that is mangled or garbage code, or it has bugs in it like that, it can be really hard to track down. Yeah, you can tell React certain parts of your application don't need to recompute, etc. React.memo is for like whole components. By the way, like you can memoize an entire component, and I think it just does something with its props, probably. I'm not actually completely sure. It's easy to forget to apply memoization or apply it incorrectly. I think this is most of the time when I've done it. Right, React has to check parts in UI that don't have any meaningful changes. This can be really useful if you've got a big program that has 3 different pieces and something like in a context changed. Well, if context changes, React will re-render everything because everything's under the context usually, if you set up your context at top level like I do. And then if you have memoization, you might say, well, this piece of the system doesn't actually really care about that. So if that didn't change, we don't care. So compiler uses its knowledge of JavaScript and React's rules to automatically memoize values or groups of values within your components or hooks. Okay, so yeah, it does that. If it detects breakage of the rules, it will automatically skip over those components and hooks. I appreciate that. That I can definitely appreciate because that's kind of the thing. And to be perfectly fair, I haven't read the rules of React. I probably break them. And the reason is I've been writing React code for 7 or 8 years, long time. And so when I learned it, I just kind of learned it on the job and didn't learn the good habits along with it. So like when I was talking earlier with, where I did some memoization and screwed up stuff, I probably wasn't following the rules properly. So it's good to know that the compiler actually deals with that. I really appreciate that from them and that's probably actually that plugin might actually let you know that, hey, you're not following the rules here, you need to change this. If your code base is well memoized, you might not expect to see major performance improvements with the compiler. In practice, memoizing dependencies that cause performance issues is tricky to get right by hand. This is true because projects are big, right? And so when you memoize something, you have to think about all the downstream effects and all that stuff and where you can memoize it and when to break that memoization. That can be really complicated. Okay, so let's see here. Ooh, what kind of memoization? Okay. Improving update performance. Re-rendering parent causes many components in its component to re-render even though only parent has changed. Right, because whenever a parent has changed, React will re-render all the children just in case. This actually, so sidebar, when I built my React Canvas, I need all the parents or all the children to re-render always, even if the parent didn't change. So I actually had to break the way that React works with that a little bit to make that happen, which was pretty interesting. So React does actually have a lot of optimization around this, but using React.memo can actually make it as well. Expensive process inside your component hooks and needs data. Yeah. So like if you do something like this, this is an excellent criteria for like a use memo, because it means that you only really want to do this expensive process when that array changes, right? And so if you just call this like in your component tree without like a hook or anything, then it will always run every single time. React express UI is function current state. Yeah. When a component state changes, React will render the component all of its children unless you've applied memoization, right? So they have a nice example here. Message button will re-render when friends list state changes, because message button is a piece of friends list. Now the thing is, message button is just kind of there. It doesn't take any props from friend list. They might have a context in common. In fact, given the fact that it doesn't take any props, I suspect that it does, but there's no need for this to re-render if this re-renders, because they're very separate. So yeah, you could just memoize this. And from my understanding, the memoization happens on message button, not actually anything in here. It's just in message button you would export a memoized version of the component. So in theirs it would be like export default react.memo message button in the message button class or file. Manual memoization, right? Okay, so we know that, yeah. Okay, so here's that expensive thing, right? You could see here the fact that this gets called every single time there's a re-render. Normally you wouldn't want to do that. I mean, if anything, you put it in like a use effect or something to do that re-render, but that's where the memoization comes in. Oh, they're not even going to show us the example, or maybe does this show us the example? Oh my god. What is this? Wow, this is such a not helpful example here. Anyway, normally, like, you could wrap this in a use memo, and with items as the parameter, and it would only call when items is done. So they do that for you. Like, these are things, I think the really big thing here, these are things that if you're an experienced React developer, you know that you should probably handle. So like an experienced React developer would already have this memoized or inside a use effect. Personally, I would use a use effect because memoization is not something that rises to the top of my head whenever I'm dealing with this stuff. It probably should, but again, I was writing React code before memoization was a thing, so it's not something I really think about. This is really where I run into the problem. I do this all the time, where just there's components that have not really, they're just in there for the structure. They don't have any actual dependency here, and they could be memoized. So this is really useful if you're not thinking about memoization. I think someone who is, really experienced React dev, i.e. not myself, probably is doing these things already, but then this would just help them, right? So I'm liking this so far. The compiler assumes your code is valid semantic JavaScript. That seems extremely reasonable. Again, it's probably running this through Babel or something to ensure that, or I wonder, actually, you could probably even put it somewhere in your Babel tree after the JSX processing, which would also handle that. Test null optional values of properties are defined for accessing them. For example, strict null checks if using TypeScript. Yeah. Again, something that I have a big problem with is not testing for these null or optional values. So if you are using TypeScript, though, this would be, will not be done for you, but the compiler would be forcing you to do it. But yeah, that's actually pretty important. And I think that's reasonable. If you're not testing for this, then, it's not reasonable for the compiler to do that for you. And follows the rules of React. Though we saw above that if the compiler detects you're not following the rules, then it just skips that component. So yeah, can verify them scaling, skip compilation when it detects an error. And then Okay, so that explains it. So this ESLint plugin actually detects the errors in the rules of React. It's not actually about the memoization. It's telling you where the compiler wouldn't run, which makes a tremendous amount of sense. Okay, should I try it? Still experimental. Again, I think it is no longer experimental. I think with the latest version, it's reached a more stable version, but I could be wrong about that. Yeah, you don't have to rush into use now. It's okay to wait until it reaches a stable release, etc. We appreciate trying out in small experiments. That makes sense. Okay, compatibility. So there is actually a health check. We really go nuts with our packages, don't we? Like the fact that there's just, I mean, and this is a complete sidebar about like the whole Node ecosystem in general, but I really do not like NPX. I don't like the idea that it just kind of temporarily installs a package and does some stuff, because in my eyes, if you're going to be doing something with a package, you should just full install it. And it leads to stuff like this. Where like, this is a package that when you think about this, you're like, oh, I just install it. It just, NPX, it just makes it work and then it goes away. Well, no, it's actually installed to your hard drive still as a global package now. And so now it's just kind of somewhere instead of being, I don't know. Obviously, you're going to have to do this. I just don't like the pattern of this. But that's because I'm a grumpy old man. How many components can be successfully? So it actually does look like it runs the compiler in a certain mode to verify that, you know, how many it could optimize. Strict mode uses. This is not something I use. I believe this is a tag that you can actually wrap your app in, and I think it. I'm not completely sure, but I think it does something like that. Oh, these are the version 18.3 docs. That's kind of interesting. Sorry, I just got distracted by that. That's no wonder it says it's in a beta state, because these are like super ancient documents. I wonder is version 20 still experimental? Where am I? There we go. Anyway, yeah, so if you're using this, I don't use this personally. I don't actually know what it does, so maybe we'll do another video on that at some point later. But I'm guessing it probably makes sure that you're not doing terrible things with your hooks. And there's some probably incompatible libraries, which makes a lot of sense. I can tell you for a fact that, again, React Canvas is probably completely incompatible with this, because while it does use React syntax, it is very different and cannot be memoized at all because of just the way it works. It tells you, okay, strict on usage. Yeah, so it's just kind of a little check. All right, you got the plugin, just pretty normal. Adds in a little rule here. Error means that the ESLint will actually give an error response. So if you're actually doing any of your CI with the ESLint, then error will actually stop the build, which is not a terrible thing. But you do want to be careful when you're introducing things to, especially to a large environment, to maybe leave this on warn to start out. Any violations, rules of React, means the compiler skipped over optimizing that component or hook. Yeah, it's perfectly okay. You don't have to fix it. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, that's how I would see you rolling out this in a large org. You probably add this as a warn. You probably hook the compiler up and get it working so that it doesn't break. And then you slowly start fixing all the errors that happen. Hooks following designed to compile existing things. It can also handle code that breaks those rules by bailing. Right. The compiler cannot catch every possible violation, may compile twice. Yeah, this is true. Because JavaScript is extremely dynamic, it's actually really, really difficult to statically parse JavaScript. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that TypeScript exists. Because even though TypeScript is also extremely dynamic, it's strongly typed and has a bunch of things in it to prevent weird accidents. So basically what they're saying is, look, we don't know what you're doing in your code. We just kind of got to guess. And sometimes you might not be doing something right in the rules of React, and we're not catching that. So for example, if you, for some reason, took the use effect and set another variable equal to it and use that variable instead, I wouldn't really expect React compiler to be able to figure that out, because that would be kind of weird and not something it's expecting. So yeah, then they're like, that's why they're like, that may accidentally compile a hook that breaks the rules of React. Now, if you do that, very likely you'll get weird bugs. And that is probably the first thing. If you're using this and you get weird bugs, that'd be the first thing I check. And so they've got, it doesn't say where, it doesn't say where this is supposed to be. This looks like a piece of Webpack config, is honestly what this looks like to me. But maybe there's a specific, because I don't know if this compiler actually runs with Webpack or Vite, or if it's like a separate thing. So yeah, it's not entirely clear where this goes, but you can kind of see what it does here. It's like, hey, is this file name here? Only run on this directory. And you could see like probably having a list of directories that are acceptable for this. You can also confirm the file and opt in. It only compiles with the use memo directive. So yeah, that's the idea there, is you just put this string, because in JavaScript, this is actually valid syntax. In fact, use strict is very similar. Not React use strict, but like JavaScript use strict. Use memo here is just a string. And so JavaScript will run over it, look at it, hopefully determine it doesn't go anywhere and just toss it. But the compiler is actually looking for that and saying, oh yeah, okay, we can utilize this. I wonder if this, oh no, it's not supposed to be in that file. Interesting. You can enable compiling the entire code base, which is default behavior. Okay, so you can use it with Babel. Includes a Babel plugin. Makes sense. It's critical to the compiler. Oh yeah, so here's the compiler config. Okay, so it goes in the Babel config. This is interesting though. It's critical the compiler run first in the pipeline. So that means they want it to run before the JSX processing. And so that means that the compiler itself will actually do JSX parsing for you. Or at least it knows how to read that code, which tells me they probably, Babel actually breaks JavaScript into tokens and then passes that onto its plugins. So my guess is that the React compiler can also do that itself, because it can run standalone. That's kind of interesting. Should run before other Babel plugins as the input source. Interesting. So I wonder if other plugins don't give it that. I don't know enough about how Babel works. Okay, and then Vite is the same. Okay, so yeah, this does go in the. Okay, so yeah, if you were doing Webpack, then you just toss it in the Babel config for Webpack, like normal. You can use the plugin to. Okay, yeah, same idea here. Yeah, right, because Vite actually has this like React plugin itself that I guess you can plug into, which is cool. I love Vite. Next.js, right, because Next.js is server-side rendering. Well, kind of, it can do server-side rendering, so it would want to know that. It's either Next.js Canary, because Next.js also needs to use that version. Presumably, Next.js is using a later version. You know what, actually, I want to look up the latest version of React. Oh, it is version 18. God, I wonder I've been hearing so much about version 20. Maybe that's in release candidate. Okay, so then I was wrong. Yeah, I thought for some reason that we were on version 19 or version 20 already of this, but I guess not. Okay, well, clearly I'm out of the loop. Okay, and then it actually just has Next.js just knows how to pick that up by default, which kind of makes sense. Option for app router. Okay, so it works in all the routers. Remix. Oh, I don't know what that is. What is Remix? That's interesting. That seems like it's a Vite thing, but like maybe it's a special Vite thing. That's kind of interesting. Oh, the new things we learn. All right. Oh, and here's Webpack, where they're like, yeah, you got to create your own loader. We're not supporting Webpack, which actually is really funny, because React and Webpack used to be really tight, and I think now that Vite's come around and Webpack's following out of style a little bit, they're not supporting it as much. React compiler loader. Okay. Oh wow, there's a bunch of other things here. They're like, yeah, no, we don't care. Uses Babel via Metro. So just like use Babel, RSPack, RSPuild. So these are all just other build systems that are popular enough that they decided to include stuff, and they're just like, no. So like you can see here, these guys have built their own plugin system for it, and they've actually supported it themselves, which is kind of cool of them. And they're probably in communication with these guys about it. Troubleshooting. Okay, interesting. Yeah, this is great because you can see how absolutely useless some of these errors are at this point. So it's good they've actually told you, yeah, you need to do this. User space implementation of the cache function is kind of interesting. I don't know what that means. Yeah, I don't know. Components have been optimized. React DevTools is built in support and will display a memo badge. Oh, that's cool. Little memo star there. So I guess if you've memoized it manually, it won't have the star, would be my guess. If you have this component violation, okay. So they're like, this is basically the same thing as above. Oh, you can specifically tell them not to. That's useful. You can specifically tell them, hey, don't memoize this. There's something wrong with it. Yeah, debugging React is actually really painful sometimes because you get errors like this. And you're just like, what the hell does that even mean? Use the memos temporary escape hatch. Yeah, so they're basically saying that oh yes, use client is like a server-side rendering thing. Use memo, use no memo, temporary escape hatch, because the idea is that at some point they'll probably remove this. Once they get, well, actually they might never remove this, to be honest, but like I'd hope they don't, but their idea is eventually this is not needed anymore if they've gotten their compiler to be a lot smarter. Confirm removing off makes sure, yeah. So this is, I mean, this is just standard debugging, right? Once you've changed something, you fixed it, you think you have a fix, get rid of all your other code changes except for that fix, see if the issue's still not there, and then stash that fix, and then make sure the issue comes back. Like that, it really makes sure that you have the smallest change set to actually handle that. Okay, well that is React compiler. I like the idea. I definitely like what it's doing because, again, I'm a developer that doesn't use memoization at all. I'm terrible with that. I don't even think about it. And luckily, most of my projects are too small for it to matter, but on really large projects, it can be really important. So I like what they're trying to do here. I think that I would imagine that in the future, they might extend React compiler to do other things, because once they get it into your tool chain, and they get it into the tool chain of your app so that it's part of the build step and you've already got it there, they can make other optimizations as necessary. Things like that. But for now, it's nice that they're not doing anything that you couldn't do yourself. I also appreciate that because that means that if you are still using React 18, then you can kind of just take advantage of this and maybe even just run the linter and nothing else and just fix kind of the issues yourself and do the memoization yourself. So yeah, definitely interested to see where this goes. Also interested to see if anyone has actually tried this out and how it worked for you, because while I can see it being a really powerful tool, I can also see it causing, some issues if you're not careful. So yeah, let me know. Thanks for being here, folks. We'll see you all next time.